Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the 7th Denman Forestry Issue Series entitled Federal Land Management Policy. We look forward to an exciting and informative program today. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issue Series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resources issues. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate our students, faculty, and staff, as well as resource professionals, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence in Forest Resources, and they support the college's vision of being a world-class and internationally recognized source of knowledge relevant to environmental and natural resource issues. The mission of the College of Forest Resources is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments, using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. In our college, we focus on programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban ecosystems, and sustainable forest enterprises. Sustainability serves as the cornerstone of our programs and includes all resources such as timber, water, or wildlife, for example, considers the needs of future generations as well as those of the present, is concerned with ecological functions and conditions, and is as much a social and economic as an ecological process. Today, we wish to focus on the topic of natural resource and environmental sustainability issues related to the management and stewardship of our federal lands. Federal natural resource managers have witnessed a great deal of change over the past 10 to 15 years, and chief among these has been a shift from an agriculturally based model to an ecologically based model, whereas the latter emphasizes desired future states of an ecosystem, the former emphasizes resource outputs produced by the system. Today, federal resource managers focus more on what is left in the forest than what is removed. Restoration of the ecosystem and more balanced use of resources is now a more common occurrence on our federal lands than in past years, and sustainable management is the stated goal of federal forest managers. Accompanying this shift in management emphasis on our federal lands has been a parallel shift in the identification of critical land management issues. In today's program, we will discuss some of these and learn how new developments at the national level are occurring. Recently, Forest Service Chief Dale Bosworth identified 4 challenges or threats to national forest management. These include the most appropriate way to manage fire and fuels, the growing occurrence of invasive plants, animals, and diseases, the loss of open space to development, and the growing occurrence of unmanaged outdoor recreational activities. Combined, the first 2 issues are often referred to as the forest health problem, the subject of President Bush's Healthy Forest Initiative, which is working its way through Congress. In addition, other topics of interest to Pacific Northwest federal land users include issues related to watershed protection and management, old growth preservation, grazing and wildlife habitat management, wilderness and roadless area management, and the possible revision of the Northwest Forest Plan. The Forest Service has also identified the following as significant management issues within the bureaucracy: the presence of excessive analysis and associated delays in planning and monitoring, an ineffective public involvement process, and management inefficiencies within the agency. They suggest that a modern management framework is required to facilitate a new era of public land management. With us today are speakers from government and higher education. Our topic this hour is College of Forest Resources research related to federal land management policy. We selected the following 3 issues because they are of extreme importance to federal lands and federal land managers. and they include a discussion of forest fires and fuel treatments, wildlife management issues, and technology for sustainable development. Following presentations by our three speakers, Undersecretary Ray will be asked to respond. Our first speaker is Dr. David Peterson. Dave is a professor of forest ecology at the UW College of Forest Resources, and he's also a research forester, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, Pacific Northwest Research Station in Seattle, where he works on the Fire and Environmental Research Applications team. Dave received his bachelor's in zoology, his master's in botany, and his PhD in forest ecology, all from the University of Illinois. Prior to joining the PNW Research Station, Dave worked at the Southwest Research Station and was the leader of the Cascadia Field Station of the U.S. Geological Survey stationed here in the college. His research interests include mountain ecology, fire ecology, and the effects of climate change on biological and human systems. He has authored numerous research papers, and in 1996, he received the Chiefs Award for Outstanding Science from the National Biological Service. The title of Professor Peterson's presentation is Addressing the Fire Problem in the West, the Role of Science-Based Fuel Treatment. Dave?
This is a topic that has been of greater interest in the last few years, as was alluded to earlier this morning. But it's always been an interest of mine from the very first day that I started as a federal scientist in 1981 with the Forest Service in Riverside, California. At that time, at least in the scientific community, we were talking about the very same issues that we're talking about in the year 2003. It's just that people weren't listening quite as much as they are now. So I'm delighted that I've lasted long enough and been persistent enough as a federal scientist to see that my time has come. And that's what my first boss told me. He said, someday this will all pay off. What I'd like to talk about today is primarily a very small portion of a current national project that's being sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service to try to make some headway on the issue of fire and fuel treatments in the western United States. I should say at the outset that I'm a little bit embarrassed on behalf of fire research that we haven't done a very good job of getting the tools to the user community like we should have. But those days, as I said this morning, are in the past, and now it's time to get on with the job. Before I go any further, I'd like to mention that we have a terrific team working on this project. In addition to myself, we have Morris Johnson, who's a Forest Service employee and a graduate student in college, Don McKenzie, Elizabeth Reinhardt, and Terry Jane at the Rocky Mountain Station of the Forest Service, as well as University of Washington staff, Jim Agee, who's the ecologist par excellence for the Pacific Northwest, and Kelly O'Brien working on outreach for this project. This has already been mentioned this morning, the 4 threats to health of U.S. forests that have been mentioned by the chief. Notice that on this list is nothing about timber management, nothing about wilderness, nothing about some of the things that were pretty much the bellwether of the 1990s in terms of environmental issues and environmental science. Fuels is the first point that's mentioned here, and also notice that fuels, invasive species, and habitat fragmentation are all very closely linked. So I don't necessarily see the top 3 here as separate as much as they are very much integrated. We've really made a shift in the paradigm as a society in the United States and North America. In the past, we pretty much feared fire. Smokey the Bear was our emblem. You still see Smokey a lot. He's one of the most widely recognized symbols of any advertising campaign that's ever been held. But we've now developed this more revisionist perspective on fire, that we want to get fire back into systems. We want to retain the role of fire in forest ecosystem management. And to tie in with some of the previous discussion this morning, I'd like to say that fire per se is not an ecological problem. It's primarily a socio-cultural problem. If people didn't live in the way of fires, it wouldn't be a big deal. Each year in the state of Alaska, something like 2 million acres burn. How much do you hear about those fires? not a heck of a lot, because you don't have a lot of people living in the way of those fires. You don't have a lot of valuable resources in terms of dollars in the way of those fires. When you have a 10,000-acre fire that occurs in the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies, it's on the front page of every newspaper because there are people who live near that fire. When you look at the house on the right side, it also brings up the issue that individuals have a certain responsibility to bear in the so-called fire problem that we're having in the West. If that were my house, I think I'd do a little tree trimming today. Another important issue is the little note that's in the right-hand corner about fire suppression costs. In 2002, we spent over $1.5 billion on fire suppression. We need to decide whether we want to continue that sort of expenditure. Well, this is sort of the stereotypical paradigm of what we have currently going on. Current conditions are that we have a lot of undergrowth in a lot of the forests in the interior west of the United States. That's shown on the left side. And that the historical perspective in a lot of these forests were of more open forests, lower densities, less understory, and bigger trees with higher crowns, as shown on the right side. Now, of course, the world isn't quite this simple, and I use this just as an example to illustrate the points I'm going to talk about. There are a couple of ways that we can modify these landscapes if we choose to. One is through mechanical thinning, basically cutting, chopping up, mulching, or otherwise removing trees and shrubs from the understory. The other is the use of fire that can be used to do the same thing, remove trees as well as understory fuels that can lead to crown fires in these dry forest types. Now, the overall objective, as I understand it, is primarily to reduce crown fire hazard, not to eliminate fires, maybe not to even eliminate big fires, but we don't want as many big crown fires in western forests. This is a value judgment, of course, and that's subject to a whole different line of debate that I'm not involved with. The guiding scientific question here, and the one that we're focusing on, is how can fuel treatments be designed to modify fire hazard and potential fire behavior? What I'd like to emphasize in my talk today is that there are scientific principles on which we can base fuel treatment. Now, we don't have the good empirical data that we need, which is why we're kind of in the mess we're in right now. But we have to get started, and we do, in fact, have some good science on which we can base fuel treatment. I'd like to tell you about three things here, namely canopy base height, canopy bulk density, and canopy continuity, as principles that forest managers can use, and these are also things that we can even use in the decision-making arena and policy debate. And finally, we can't forget that we cannot just do this thinning operation, but we also have to reduce surface fuels, otherwise we're still going to continue to have a threat of crown fires. And I'll talk more about that. The first principle is this notion of canopy base height. It's pretty simple in concept. It's basically the lower height of the main part of the canopy. If you don't want crown fires, you have to keep the fire out of the canopy of the forest. In the upper slide, you see the sort of stereotypical dense forest with a lot of ladder fuels that carry fire up into the crown. It has very low canopy base height. In the lower panel, you see a forest that has had a lot of the understory removed, but notice it has most of the big trees remaining. So thinning doesn't necessarily mean you're removing all the big trees. In fact, those big trees are the ones that are most fire resistant because they have the highest crowns and the thickest bark. The point here is that if we can raise that canopy base height sufficiently, we can keep surface fires from reaching the crown of the forest. The second principle relates to this thing called canopy bulk density, and I'll try not to bore you with technical details, but in simple terms, canopy bulk density is the mass of the foliage, the twigs, the branches, and all that other stuff in the canopy in a particular volume. Forests that are dense and have thick understories have high canopy bulk density. Forests that have been thinned or have low stem density and high crowns typically have low bulk density. So we need to lower the bulk density to a critical level, at which point fire will not easily spread through that canopy. The third principle, and one that's much more difficult to quantify, is canopy continuity. This is simply the connectedness of the crowns of individual trees within the forest stand. This is shown in the two diagrams to the left as well as the little diagrams on the right, but I think it's nicely viewed from above. And we can see the dense canopy in the upper figure and the low density canopy in the lower figure. Imagine if a fire does get into the crown of one of these trees. In the lower figure, it'll be much more difficult for that fire to spread from tree to tree. This does not guarantee that you're going to save all trees or all big trees, but it gives you a fighting chance of saving most of those trees. It can also make a particular stand more defensible if you choose to do fire suppression in that stand. Now, you can't just do some thinning and walk away from it. You also have to remove sufficient surface fuels so that you don't have this risk of crown fire. The worst thing we can do is to do a lot of thinning, do a lot of cutting, and then just leave all the slash, leave all the wood there. You might actually make the situation worse than when you started. So you have to remove that material, you have to chop it up, or perhaps burn it through prescribed burning. This is a lifetime, many lifetime job of continuity in fuel treatment and maintenance of fuels, both in the overstory and understory. The funny thing is about forests, once you cut the trees, other trees grow back, and understory fuels grow back. So you have to stay on top of this. This means keeping good data, this means monitoring, this means having an administrative and decision-making institution in place that will govern this over many decades. The best thing that we as scientists can do is to develop the quantitative guidelines that managers need to do the fuel treatments. We need the scientific basis to do this work. We don't want this to be art and philosophy, we want this to be science. We also need to be very aware of integrating social and cultural values with our fuel treatments, that it's not just an ecological or scientific endeavor. I also think that we need a rational economic approach. We need to allow the agencies to do their job, particularly at a local level, and to give them the resources they need to do that. Part of that also means we need to make better decisions about how we expend money in the federal agencies in terms of fire suppression versus everything else. And finally, I think we need to make those folks aware who live in this wildland-urban interface, in this great influx of population we have near federal lands, that they bear a lot of responsibility in assisting with fuel treatments. Wherever you live, you bear responsibilities for certain hazards and uncertainties. Here, living in Seattle, we have a lot of earthquakes. In other parts of the country, you have tornadoes. Wherever you live, you have risks and potential catastrophes, and we all need to take responsibility for where we live and how we live. So in closing, I would say I'd like to ask this group of people in here, in this room, it represents a broad range of expertise and different academic and scientific and management backgrounds. Please, can we work together on this? Let's get started. Let's get it done. We need to get more acres treated, and we need to do it in a scientific manner that will match some of the issues talked about by Dean Baer in terms of sustainability of natural resources and social systems in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for those informative remarks. We now turn from the issue of forest fires and fuel treatments to wildlife management. And our second speaker is Professor John Marsleff. John is a professor of wildlife science at the UW College of Forest Resources. His bachelor's degree is in wildlife biology from the University of Montana. His MS is in biology, and his PhD is in zoology, both from Northern Arizona University. John's research interest includes studying the effects of forest fragmentation on the nest predators of the marbled murrelet and a variety of songbirds in coastal Washington, how to conserve birds native to the Pacific Islands, and studying how birds respond to urbanization. He believes strongly in cooperative research, which involves all stakeholders concerned with any particular issue. One such effort is his active participation in a new graduate education program in urban ecology here at the UW. The title of John's presentation is the ABCs of maintaining viable populations of wildlife on federal forest lands. John?
I'd like to talk about some simple things that I hope we can do to enhance wildlife viability on national lands. I don't disagree with much of what I've heard today, but I disagree with what I haven't heard. And I haven't heard anything about viability of wildlife populations, and I think we need to discuss that. In fact, the people of the Pacific Northwest are very much in understanding the importance of federal policy to our region's wildlife. Just a casual looking at the paper, I couldn't help but bring Saturday's paper with me today from the Seattle Times. Headline is about endangered species and the effects of federal policy on the potential on the Endangered Species Act. A few pages in, we've got something more about federal policy and easing of regulations for mining claims and the effects on wildlife in both of those situations is of paramount importance to the people of the Pacific Northwest. I doubt, however, that many of us understand how important Forest Service lands are to wildlife values here. In fact, the greatest proportion of endangered species on federal lands occur on Forest Service lands, not some of the other lands we're more familiar with. We all enjoy our nation's wildlife, and here in the Northwest in particular, we like to experience the pleasures of what federal lands provide for us. They provide birds at our feeders in our homes, even though we're not on federal lands. And they provide salmon for us to fish for in our streams around here. And they allow us to track majestic elk and other stunning wildlife in the meadows and clearcuts that occur around federal lands. Our public forests are quite simply what I would refer to as the green heart of our region. They support healthy animal populations that bolster the less locally sustainable populations that actually live with us in the human-dominated portions of our landscape. And in so doing, the federal forests keep people literally connected to nature, and they keep our culture vibrant, diverse, and stimulated by our mysteries and wonders. So today, I'd like to pass on some very general and simple prescriptions to keep the green heart healthy. I'll stay away from detailed wildlife habitat relationships, which are important, but often very local to talk about in general terms. First, I want to take up some of the issues that have been presented about the context in which our world currently exists and provide hopefully some imagery that will back up many of the comments you've already heard today. So first, let's put this issue of wildlife conservation and management in a world context. And in the world setting, this view of the Earth at night, taken from satellite imagery, shows the domination of especially the north temperate regions by human habitation. All those lights, or the majority of those lights, are associated with settlement. We can bring it a little closer to home and just look at the U.S. context. And the western U.S., and especially the intermountain U.S., stand out as one of the last places in the United States where, in fact, we're not in a sea of light. And in fact, there is some dark areas that are not closely inhabited by people. We can look also at the federal land context itself and learn a bit about the distribution of lands. Many of us are familiar here in the Northwest, especially with the fact that most federal lands are high elevation, mountainous, spectacular scenery, but not such spectacular wildlife habitat. So the area here, this is shown from work by Andy Hansen and his colleagues at Montana State University, is Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone National Park is the YNP there, and that federal land, along with Teton National Forest and the Gallatin National Forest, are primarily rocky, low productivity soils. They're spectacular to look at, but they're not very spectacular to grow wildlife and trees on. The red portions of that diagram show the areas that are of highest productivity for one species of wildlife, the yellow warbler. Arguably a beautiful, important bird, but not of primary importance in driving the policy of subdividing land here. And in fact, most of that red occurs on private lands. So although a lot of the productive land occurs on private, a lot of the productive area for this species occurs on private lands, an awful lot of most of the conserved land here occurs on federal property. So we not only have important areas set aside, we also have a mismatch between the areas set aside and potentially some of the areas important for some species of wildlife. We've mentioned recreation several times today. And the effective recreation is also not simply to try to provide enough recreation opportunities for a growing public that wants to use our lands, but also to save some of this land for healthy wildlife populations. Some of our work shown here, my students and I have done looking at nest predation, in this case on the Olympic National Forest and Olympic National Park. And what we see in the yellow area here, I'll try it again. The yellow zone is a campground, more a campground, out on the Olympic Peninsula. And the contour map shown there is not a contour of elevation, but it's a contour of use by nest predators. Species like the Townsend's chipmunk, Douglas squirrel, and Steller's jay, which all prey upon other birds' nests, in my case of interest, but also other species as well. And the point here is that, as is the case in most recreational areas where people play a large role, we also supplement some species greater than others. These are the species often supplemented by our Cheetos and breadcrumbs that we leave around, and they then increase in numbers and further reduce the suitability of some of these federal lands, here recreational spots, for other wildlife. So in sum, for the context that we need to view wildlife populations, and we have an increasing human population, puts increasing pressures on our forested lands growing in from the sides. We have federal lands that are characterized by this isolation, their occurrence on soils of low productivity, and an increasing demand to supply multiple benefits such as campgrounds, which have some detrimental effects. So the maintaining of viable wildlife populations has to be done within this context. Federal forest managers are also mandated to keep vertebrates viable, vertebrate populations viable. This is stated in the National Forest Management Act. It's a noble challenge of that act. It's an extremely difficult challenge of this act, but it has huge payoffs. If indeed it works, we will not need the Endangered Species Act very often. If the National Forest Management Act would maintain viable populations on Forest Service lands where many endangered species occur, there would be no need for ESA listings there. It would be handled by that act rather than the ESA. It can help create diversity, which may increase the sustainability and resilience of these lands to other challenges. We've heard many mentions of the ecological services that such vibrant lands can provide. And they also provide immense cultural stimulation. They have reliable economic returns, and I believe it's possible to maintain viable populations in these areas, but it is not easy. So let me just give you three basic, easy things that we can think about. The details are going to take years and a lot of brilliant minds to work on. So the ABCs of possibility, as I call them here, are simply A for alpha diversity, and that's just structural complexity at the local scale. This is going to be difficult when we're also trying to reduce complexity at the local scale for fire prevention. But I think we can resolve that with respect to the other two aspects here. B for beta diversity, which is regional diversity, not doing the same thing everywhere. And C is for coordinating our actions so that we can accomplish both A and B with other constraints such as fire concerns. So let's look at the reason, the biological reason for alpha diversity. This is a long known rule. It's nothing new here, and it's certainly not rocket science, as Dave pointed out. It simply refers to this relationship, in this case illustrated with birds, that as you increase the diversity in an area, the structural diversity here of a forest, how many different layers in a forest, so to speak, on the x-axis there, the number of birds found in that area increases. It's a general relationship. I give a couple other examples here of increasing bird diversity with forest age in Pacific Northwest forests. And also in our work in the urbanizing area, the greater the structural diversity in yards and other settings, the greater the diversity of birds and small mammals as well. So strategies to do that, obviously you keep some areas diverse. You don't thin everything, you don't burn everything, and you don't reduce the chance of fire everywhere at the same time. So beta diversity is I think, stated most nicely here in this quote by my colleague Fred Bunnell up at UBC. So biological diversity, particularly the current levels, cannot be sustained by doing the same thing everywhere. This is a wildlife biologist's nightmare to think of our federal forest looking something like this, thinned, pruned, manicured, perhaps to reduce forest fire threat, which I'd agree is obviously important in a lot of areas, but not everywhere. So how do we do that? Again, fairly simple things. Maintain a mixture of patches of various seral stages. maintain a mixture of patch sizes, keep important legacies in some areas to increase the local or alpha level diversity there. And some of these unhealthy processes are indeed critical, not over huge areas all the time, and I certainly agree that we need to reduce some of these threats, but insects and fire are great for woodpeckers, and I like woodpeckers a lot. The last thing is a need for national coordination. And I would suggest something like a FEMAT type of summit that had occurred for other issues in the Northwest in the last few years might be a productive way to get wildlife experts to at least put their views out on the table of how we might prioritize national, regional, and forest scale management to do some of the issues for wildlife, just as Dave and his colleagues have been doing for fire. We do this in a variety of ways. But basically, by calling these folks together, we could discuss issues such as where to cut, how much to cut, what pattern to create, or in other words, at what scale should we do the same thing everywhere, and then how to monitor these results. So as a quick summary, 3 easy basic things: maintain structural diversity in a variety of places, don't do the same thing everywhere, and plan so that we make sure we don't do the same thing everywhere. As much as I think some of these interesting ideas about using a variety of different governing structures would be interesting to see the result of, we still need some central coordination so that we don't end up doing the same thing everywhere. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, for your comments and observations. In our third presentation, we're going to take a look at technology that's available to help us with our desire to achieve sustainable management. And our final speaker is Professor Bruce Lipke. Bruce is a professor of forest economics at the UW College of Forest Resources. His bachelor's degree is in electrical engineering from the University of Nebraska, and his Master of Science is in electrical engineering from New Mexico State University. He also earned a Master of Science in Operations Research and Industrial Engineering from the University of California at Berkeley, and an Executive Business Management Certificate from the UW. He is currently the director of the UW Washington State University Rural Technology Initiative, and he's president of the Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials. Prior to assuming his current positions, Bruce worked at Weyerhaeuser and at Wharton Econometrics. He also was the director of Centrifor here at the college for about 1 decade. His research interests include the impact of alternative forest management strategies and regulations on the environment and the competitiveness of the forest products industry. The title of his presentation is Sustainable Management Tools for Technology Transfer.
We're going to focus a little bit closer on the tools. That's where the rubber meets the road in a way. That's where the people are most impacted. They feel the impacts the greatest. And we can argue about it perhaps, but they probably understand the problems better. Now, what's needed and what can we offer? Well, first of all, in our area here, rural stakeholders came to us seeking faster, better technology transfer. Well, why did they come to us? Well, number one, we have a whole set of new complex regulations. And they said it's beyond us to figure out how to survive under these new regulations. There was a general feeling that we could get better science implemented. That is, the science was ahead of the implementation process. And this really is an issue of technology transfer. In addition to that, there is the opportunity to develop better community consensus. By better tools, it is actually easier to form consensus, maybe not so much on the national scale, but certainly on the community-based scale where most of the action is. And finally, there was even a recognition that the urban versus rural income disparity had grown dramatically in the last decade, and that something really needed to be done, and especially in timber resource-dependent communities. So how do we do this? Well, our objective is to develop tools that can assist this implementation process. Fundamental areas, certainly forest management, engineering, roads. If you think about the more detailed topics, it's habitat, shade, large woody debris for repair and protection, pest and fire risk reductions, carbon sequestration, road and culverts for sedimentation analysis, and not to leave out the economic and ecological trade-offs. And secondly, with tools, you have to support the technology transfer. That fundamentally means training, lots of presentations, which we give, and communications in a broad sense, of which there is much on the web, and to work with rural groups so that we can get past the difficult parts of science and get on to the implementation. So let's talk a little bit about these tools and the applications. Our certainly most sophisticated tool, and the one that we probably use the most in the Rural Technology Initiative, is the landscape management system that was developed here at the University of Washington. And what it does is to predict many different outputs for any forest planning pathway. It's a complex piece of software. It's not fundamental science. It draws on the science that's there and integrates that so that you can get a flavor for what happens if you do things differently. Now, as a subpart of that, we've now developed assessment procedures so that if you have a desired future condition of restoring some old growth functionality or some other set of parameters, you can in fact measure whether or not your pathway is in fact reaching that condition or what percentage of the time it's reaching it. And that economic pathway might also include economic viability, because if we don't maintain the economic viability, we may lose the lands to forestry. Other tools, road layout, culvert design, sediment control, all sorts of GIS and GPS applications, and even the development of landowner databases so the legislature knows where the small owners are and how they're being impacted. So let's talk a little bit about the landscape management system. Fundamentally, it's an inventory-based system. We collect inventory for every polygon, if you will, or stand, if you will, on the forest, characterize it in a tremendous amount of numbers, and then have the ability to do any number of things with this in the sense of simulation. Well, one of the simulations of most interest is just the visualizations, which are actually visualization tools developed by a Forest Service employee, Bob McGoy, who actually works with us here at the university. You can look at stand visualizations from different perspectives. You can also look at landscape visualizations. It's really pretty interesting when you're working with rural consortiums to realize that here's which one is the real stand and which one is the simulated stand. Well, this is actually the real stand. The trees are randomly placed, or are placed where they grew. Here's the simulated stand, and the trees are still randomly placed. One of these days when our computer power gets high enough, we'll probably put them in the right places. But it's amazing how close the replications are and how much it does to groups of people that are arguing about, well, what is the desired future condition we want for these stands? With the landscape management system, you can simulate all sorts of different management pathways from no action to any number of thinning treatments along the lines of the fuel reduction treatments that Dave Peterson talked about, and look at what they look like over any given period of time. But not just what they look like. There are a whole host of outputs that come with this kind of technology. We get volumes, visuals, stand structure, classes, diversity measures, habitat indice measures, economics, risks of fire, wind throw, infestation, and disease. And one of the more difficult ones that we've added this year is carbon. Just taking the fire risk scenario as an example, again using programs from the Forest Service, we have incorporated their Forest Fuels Extension Model, FFE, along with their Forest Vegetation Simulator, which is the growth model. They're both tied in with LMS. So as a consequence, we can now, as a part of any management alternative, derive what would be called a crowning index, which is the risk of a ground fire becoming a crown fire, very much like Dave Peterson was describing what it is that's going to drive that. Now, once you have this tool, what does it allow you to do? Well, when we looked at the Okanagan forest, we found actually almost 80% of the stands were in the moderate to high risk class. However, many of the high-risk stands were wilderness areas, which we said were not going to be treated one way or the other, so we left them out. But in addition, whenever you look at these stands, you can look all sorts of canopy structure information that's related to these, so you get a better understanding of what conditions were in fact creating these kind of risk conditions. And if you want to summarize down to the issue of reducing fire risk and what it cost, here we have a revenue scale where these whiter bars are the revenue. The no action, of course, is no revenue, but we have very high fire risk. And of course, with different kind of treatments, we can get the fire risk down to low levels, and depending upon how the treatment went, we can see what it actually cost us. Now, of course, there's really a large variance in those costs, so it's a lot more complex than just looking at that. But in addition, we can look at the other variables, not just the economics, but the habitat suitability and how it responds to different treatments. And you pick the species that are of greatest interest to the local biologist for this forest area, so it becomes a local, customized challenge to figure out what's the best that you can do in any given area. Carbon is one of the more interesting ones to me, probably because I've invested too much of my life on trying to figure out how to model carbon sequestration. It's also one of the more complicated. First of all, you have to measure the carbon in the standing forest, but that's by no means the end of the carbon story. Very much of the carbon, in fact, the increasing carbon storage is actually stored in products. And then, of course, there's the fossil fuel displacement. That is biomass being used for energy. If, in fact, we can recover the small diameter trees that are, in fact, creating the high fuel hazards, we generate energy and we get the benefits of much less carbon. And we know that treating these small diameter fuel burdened stands are high cost. These are some estimates of costs, kind of on average. But the fact of the matter is, these costs are based only on market costs and market revenues, and leave out all of these other costs, the firefighting costs, the regeneration costs, the facility losses and fatalities, the timber losses themselves, and certainly our willingness to pay for the habitat better be as high as the timber value, or we wouldn't be leaving the stands, carbon and green energy credits, and more. So what are the advantages of LMS? Forest planning for all sorts of different outputs. Incorporate the best available science. LMS is not the science. It is simply the vehicle to display the science that's available. It's PC freeware for small owners and rural communities. That means it's available for consortiums doing public land and private land management planning. It's transparent among all the things that are important. It's not sitting on a mainframe back in the office. All the science is transparent and available to people, so it's helpful in consensus building. And it is a training platform that is very useful, and in fact, at the moment, landscape management system is being used in a number of community colleges. Now, we're developing many other tools. GIS information is prevalent in many models. Global positioning system information is prevalent. Probably one of the more complex ones, not in the landscape sense, but yes, it still is in a way, and that's stream crossing and road upgrade tools. Here's an example of placement of culverts, cross drains. Before using the tool, the normal guidelines suggested 16 cross drains, and you can see by the area where the sediment was, actually reducing 3 cross drains and positioning them better did a 57% reduction in sediment using typical sediment models. It's almost amazing what you can find on websites. And even just looking at our website, www.ruraltech.org, you could spend a few days just on the website learning about various aspects, using these tools, doing simulations of the future and many different alternatives. And with that, I think I should open it up to Bruce Baer and Mark Ray.
Thank you, Bruce, for that discussion of future technologies for sustainable management. We're now at the point in the program where we will invite Mark Ray to respond to comments he's heard from the previous speakers. Mark Ray was appointed Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment in October 2001. He oversees the department's Forest Service and Natural Resources Conservation Service. In the past, Mark served as a staff member with the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. He was Vice President of Forest Resources for the American Forest and Paper Association and Executive Director for the American Forest Resource Alliance. Mark is a native of Ohio and holds Bachelor of Science degrees in Wildlife Management and Forestry and a Master of Science degree in Natural Resources Policy and Administration, all from the University of Michigan. I'm proud to present Undersecretary Mark Ray for his response.
Thank you again, Dean Baer, and I want to thank the Denmans for the philanthropy that made this interesting day possible. I'm glad to see that all of our subsequent speakers took me up on my request that they provide help in helping us address the problems that confront us today. And I think that we heard some good ideas from the speakers, some of which I'll be taking back with me to talk with the agency employees and the Forest Service and other government agencies about. It's a little daunting to respond to so much information, sort of on the fly, but that's kind of how I spend most days, so I'll just wade right in. I thought the presentation on fire was a very good one, and I'm hopeful that it will be watched and listened to by a large number of people throughout the West, particularly those contemplating buying or building a house somewhere in the vicinity of one of our national forests. I will say that while interesting, it didn't cover the full gamut of the kinds of treatments that we need to do. It was, I think, an accurate depiction of what we need to do in the ponderosa pine and mixed conifer systems, but the kinds of thinning and load reduction that were described is not what we need to be doing, nor will it be particularly helpful in some of our rangelands or chaparral systems and in the lodgepole pine systems where we don't normally succeed in reducing fire risk by thinning. There we're looking at strategic fuel breaks and other kinds of treatments. And it's important that people appreciate the difference between those kinds of systems and the necessary treatments, because otherwise I'll spend all of my time explaining somebody who lives in a lodgepole pine forest why we're doing fuel breaks rather than thinning. And indeed, the lodgepole pine systems are now increasingly ones that are being developed, particularly in the northern Rockies, and where we're seeing fire intensities which have been even a higher level of abnormality than what we've seen in ponderosa pine in the recent past. I also think it's important to focus on the wildland-urban interface, and that's pretty much what we've said our top priority is, together with the Western governors in the system that we're using to prioritize fuels treatment work. But I think it's also important to inform people that the wildland-urban interface isn't our only focus. There are ecological values at risk in other areas that we're trying to protect and that justify treatments that need to be done. Additionally, there are watershed, particularly municipal watershed values that are at risk that don't get protected by simply treating the wildland-urban interface. So as you look at what we do in selecting fuels treatment priorities over the next several years, you're going to see a lot of work done in the wildland-urban interface, but that's not where you're going to see our exclusive efforts devoted. You'll see it devoted in other areas where there are other resource values at risk, particularly fish and wildlife habitat values, which have been degraded in many cases because of catastrophic fire. I think the fact that the largest concentrations of populations of endangered species are found on federal lands, as Dr. Marsluff indicated, is a pretty good indication that despite all that's gone wrong so far, we have been doing something right, because those populations are there. They're either as a consequence or despite the work that we've done in the past 100 years. And while it is important to maintain the integrity of the habitat the national forests provide, it is equally important, I think, to put that objective in a broader context. One of the areas of rethinking that I've asked our wildlife biologists and range conservationists to involve themselves with over the last 2 years is to look at the incremental value of animal unit month reductions on federal lands in enhancing wildlife habitat against the cost in the loss of privately owned ranch lands. Because if we protect one habitat only to jeopardize, diminish, and eventually eliminate another, we haven't made an overall net gain in achieving wildlife habitat objectives. And so I've asked our people to be less purist in dealing with our lessees in the interest of trying to make sure that they remain our lessees and not real estate sellers to the next subdivision of McMansions that are going to be constructed in their wake after their disappearance. I like the idea of a national effort to coordinate wildlife habitat priorities. I would submit that the agency is midway in an effort to do just that, in the effort that has been underway to revise and modernize the forest planning regulations, including that part of the regulations dealing with wildlife viability, species viability. And it will remain, I guess, for everyone to decide at the conclusion of that effort, which involved a fairly extensive dialogue with practitioners in the field and wildlife scientists, how close they've come. The ABCs of diversity was an interesting concept, but it suffers from the same problem that collegiate grading systems do, and that is everybody wants an A. Everybody wants alpha diversity in their particular locale and finds it difficult to accept that in order to get a B, not everyone can have an A. And therefore, I leave you with that observation as a problem with the ABCs of biological diversity and college grading scores at the same time. I appreciated once again the landscape management system. As somebody who is almost wholly illiterate from a computer standpoint, I'm glad that many people are using it and understand its value. Primarily, what it does is empower the kind of alternative organizational structures and dialogues that Dr. Lee talked about. More than anything we will do in changing statutes or regulations at the federal level, the work that's being done to provide technologies to people who want to get together to find a way to work out an agreement to the conflicts that divide them is most important of all. When you take one of these jobs, it becomes a humbling experience because you just think about how daunting it's going to be. I know when the call came from the White House to tell me that I was the one who'd been selected, it wasn't a time where I immediately jumped for joy. Rather, I just sort of sat quietly and said a simple prayer. I said, Lord, if I'm going to do this, let me serve during a period of budget surpluses and above average rainfall. And you can see how I'm doing so far. And with that, I will relinquish the stage and bid you a good day.
Thank you, Mark. You touched on all 5 of our speakers and did a good job. This concludes our discussion of the College of Forest Resources research related to federal land management policy. We trust that you enjoyed the program you have just watched and that you found it informative. If you have questions, please send us an email addressed to cfruw@u.washington.edu. Thank you for watching.